I'm actually very excited for Beast of Reincarnation. I hope it ends up actually reviewing well, and I do plan on getting it and benchmarking it on the channel. It's developed by Game Freak, who are famous for making the Pokemon games. However, it's their Team B, which is responsible for trying to develop new IP ideas, and it's a small team that then is actually developing the game using a bunch of outside external studios, contractors, which I think explains why they're using Unreal Engine 5 rather than any of their in-house technology. If you're using a lot of contracting studios, etc., I think it's more reasonable to expect everybody to understand how to use Unreal Engine 5 rather than necessarily internal tools. That being said, Unreal Engine 5 isn't always known for its performance, so we do have the PC system requirements now to take a look at. And, well, first of all, the initial time they posted them, which is what you're seeing on the left, they were absolutely nonsensical, and they've now updated them, which is what you're seeing on the right. Originally, they were asking for things like an RTX 4060 16GB, which doesn't exist. It's either an 8GB 4060, or they may have meant the 4060 Ti, which does have a 16GB version, but either way, this does not make sense. And they were also pairing it with the 6900 XT, which does exist, but is completely different performance tier. They were also recommending at least 32GB of system RAM and 24GB minimum, which in the age of RAM prices being what they are right now, that's a lot to ask for a minimum spec just to run the game at performance mode upscaling at 30 FPS with a 1080p output at low settings. It just seemed a little nonsensical, along with calling a 1070 Ti an RTX GPU, which it isn't, it's GTX. I mean, that's a minor typo, but there's multiple. Like a Ryzen 5 5500X also doesn't exist. There's a 5500, but a non-X version, there is no X version. So overall, the first time that they posted this looked really sloppy, riddled with typos and nonsensical stuff. So they have now acknowledged that some of you may have noticed that minimum and recommended specs were added to the store page recently. The specs that were initially posted had some mistakes. Yeah, they did. And the new specs listed on the page are correct. Of course, testing cannot cover every possible hardware configuration, but this should generally be good guidance for players. So they are saying that they have now put a little more effort into this, and these should be correct. So they're acknowledging they took a second look. They spent more time on this. So we could put a little more stock into what it says now. Now, they're acknowledging that they can't go over every possible hardware configuration, but that's where we'll use things like the Tech Power Up Relative Performance chart, which I'll link in the video description, which, while not specifically targeting this game, and every game can performance differently compared to averages, and this represents more of a typical average result, you can maybe find your GPU relative to the ones that it's listing in the chart to get a better idea of how your system will perform relative to what they are asking for. So with that in mind, let's take a closer look at the right-hand side of the screen, the one above me right now, which is the one that they are saying actually makes sense, and is actually correct, at least for the hardware specs that it's listing. Now, I'll just say right now, a little bit concerning, maybe that's an understatement, very concerning, that they're targeting DLSS performance mode, or FSR3 performance mode upscaling, just to hit a 1080p output resolution. That would be 540p internal rendering resolution, within a 1080p output resolution reconstructed at 60 FPS at just medium settings. And they're asking for an RTX 3060 or RX 6700 XT in order to get there. Now, in and of itself, recommending an RTX 3060 or 6700 XT for, playing a game at 1080p 60 FPS, not crazy concerning. And honestly, these GPUs are aging now. We're talking a 5.5-year-old GPU with the RTX 3060. It came out in, January of 2021. I guess it was actually available in the end of February. And, it wasn't massively expensive, at least MSRP-wise. That was the cryptocurrency boom, though, so it ended up being pretty expensive on the actual market. But that beside the point. The point is, asking for that for your recommended spec in and of itself, not crazy, but asking it to be performance mode upscaling 540p internal rendering resolution in order to get there at just medium settings, that's a little bit more concerning. I test out a lot of games on the RTX 3060. Actually, most new games that I benchmark on the channel, I use the 3060 as a pretty popular Steam GPU. Somebody bought a mid-range system 5 years ago, and it's pretty representative of that. However, I'm usually not having to use performance mode upscaling just to hit 1080p 60 FPS at medium settings. Oftentimes more like quality level upscaling might get you there on a 1080p output. And maybe if I was trying to do 1440p, I'd be needing to go to more to performance mode. So a little bit concerning there. Also, while I'm happy they dropped the memory requirement down to 16 gigabytes, there's still some things that don't make a lot of sense here. Like the 3060 and the 6700 XT aren't particularly close in performance. The RTX 3060, if we set that as the baseline on Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart, maybe you'll spot your GPU around here along the way. Like if you have a 1080 Ti, that's similar ballpark performance, or a RX 6600 XT, or a 2070 Super, or a 2080. We're still in this general ballpark. Even a 4060's kind of in this general ballpark. A 6700 XT generally might be almost 30% faster than a 3060. So there's a bit of a gap there. So I do have some thoughts. One thought could be that the reason they didn't pick the closer AMD match like a 6600 XT, which is the better performance match for a 3060, could be the VRAM. A 6600 XT only has 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Can't speak. Whereas the 3060 12 gigabyte version, and they are specifying it is the 12 gigabyte version, has, 12 gigabytes of VRAM, which means that it's possible that they're suggesting that 8 gigabyte GPUs could be having problems even at medium settings 1080p with performance mode upscaling. Now that's speculation. Given how nonsensical their previous system requirements were, it's also possible that I'm just reading too much into this. Also, some games do just perform better on NVIDIA than AMD, especially AMD's 6000 series GPUs did not have very strong hardware-based ray tracing performance. So if their medium graphics preset is actually using hardware Lumen in Unreal Engine 5, which would be unusual, but not impossible, that could also explain the performance difference and could also explain why they're needing to go all the way to performance mode upscaling to hit 60 FPS on these classes of GPUs. So I'm wondering if there's hardware Lumen involved here, or like I said, if 8 gigabytes was the problem, or they're just picking an unusual pairing here for reasons. And like I said, the previous system specs were such a gigantic mess. You can only read so much into it. Now, they've also reduced their recommended CPUs from the original post, where originally they asked for an i5 14600K or Ryzen 9 5900X. They've now reduced that to a i7 12700K or Ryzen 7 5800X, which again is a little bit better. I would personally hope that a Ryzen 5 5600X could still hit a 60 FPS. By the way, the resolution is less relevant for CPUs. The kinds of work a CPU does is not heavily affected by the rendering resolution in most cases. It's more affected by things like how many NPCs are in the environment, things that you're calculating physics on, all sorts of things. And Unreal Engine 5 can be very CPU heavy, especially in NPC-dense environments, especially in earlier versions of Unreal Engine. I'm not sure which version they're using in this, but so that's a little bit heavy on the CPUs, but at least better than what they were saying in their initial system spec. Now, if we go down to the minimum spec, they're targeting low settings at 1080p 40 FPS with still using performance mode upscaling, this time suggesting that you might even need to go down to FSR 1 performance mode. FSR 1 is a spatial upscaler. It's not even having multiple frames to then try to reconstruct a higher resolution image. It's just using one single frame. And so when you're using performance mode upscaling at 1080p output with FSR 1, you get a terrible looking image. It can't reconstruct any actual detail, and it just looks, it's very painterly. It kind of reminds me of an oil painting. So hey, interesting. But they're suggesting that you could get 40 FPS at low settings, 1080p with that performance mode upscale on a GTX, hey look, they got it right now, 1070 rather than 1070 Ti, so they did reduce that a bit from their previous. Also, previously, they were targeting 30 FPS 1080p with performance mode upscaling at low settings. Now they're suggesting you could actually get 40 FPS rather than just 30. This is interesting. Most game developers on their system requirements charts either say 30 or 60, and if they get 40, they just call it 30. So this does tell me that they actually did probably playtest this a bit and realize, well, we could actually claim 40 FPS here. But again, that's with performance mode upscaling. At low settings, and they did drop it down to a 1070 rather than 1070 Ti and correct it to being GTX. They're also pairing that with an RX 580, and they are mentioning that it's the 8GB version. I believe there were also 4GB versions of that card. And they've dropped the memory requirement to 16GB, whereas previously they asked for 24GB. They've also dropped the CPUs from a i7 10700K to an i5 8400, and from a Ryzen 5 5500X, which didn't exist, but I'm assuming they meant 5500, to a Ryzen 5 3600, which actually has fairly close performance to the Ryzen 5 5500. But anyway, so there's that. Now, like I said, they're claiming 40 FPS here. Now, if we look at this on the relative performance chart over here, we can drop from that 3060, which was the recommended spec, and we can scroll down to the 1070. We can see that we're dropping things down to 69% of the performance of the 3060. And let's set the 1070 as the baseline now. And so this was a 2016 GPU. So we are talking decade-old hardware at this point. So there's that. So launched a decade ago at $379, GTX 1070. Now they're pairing it with the RX 580 from AMD. Now, generally, that would be noticeably less performant than the GTX 1070. So, again, kind of a larger than you would expect performance gap between the AMD and NVIDIA hardware that they're placing on this list. However, interestingly, in this case, sorry, look at the current ones here. Whereas on the recommended spec, the NVIDIA GPU is weaker than the AMD GPU, maybe suggesting the game is more optimized for NVIDIA. Now, they're listing a higher-end NVIDIA GPU paired with a lower-end AMD GPU, which would suggest the alternative. So maybe more optimized the other way around. I don't know. Maybe it depends on the generation here or what. But anyway, so all I can say is that this certainly indicates this is going to be one of the more demanding Unreal Engine 5 titles if this is at all correct. And they did mention that they did take more time to correct this, and they are saying that this is correct, at least for the hardware being listed. They just couldn't test every possible hardware configuration. So if you take them at their word on that, I would say that this looks pretty demanding, one of the heavier Unreal Engine 5 games, but I do plan on benchmarking this one on the channel. I guess we'll find out fairly soon. They did also clarify release times. So they're saying that the launch time, several people have asked about launch timing due to the release date being listed as August 3rd on Steam. So we want to confirm that the game will be available at 0000 UTC on August 4th. So in terms of local release time, this means that the game will unlock Monday evening in the Americas, overnight for Europe, Africa, West Asia, and Central Asia, and Tuesday morning for East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. So there's all of that. Now, like I said, I am interested in the game from a what I've seen of the gameplay, it seems to have an interesting, like, kind of a very parry-based timing stuff. Kind of reminds me a little bit of, Sekiro sort of a situation. And then there's also a place where you can pause and sort of issue more strategic command moves to your dog character, Ku, I think it is, that comes with you. So, I'm hoping this actually ends up being a good game, regardless of what the performance ends up being. I'm also hoping that we don't end up having like a lot of stutters and things like that. So there's a lot to find out, but at least on a surface level, does look like an interesting game to me, at least, despite the system requirements, which are now better and less nonsensical, but still, I would say, on the heavy side, very reliant on upscaling. All right, hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Let me know if you are interested in me benchmarking this game when it releases, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.